For nearly half a century, the US-China relationship appeared to be a story of mutual gain, booming trade, cultural exchange, and global optimism. But beneath the surface lay a fragile truth. It was never built on shared values, only on temporary strategic necessity. What began as Cold War pragmatism and economic ambition soon hardened into the engagement trap, a grand illusion that commerce would breed democracy. When the Soviet threat vanished and China's model proved immune to Western liberalization, the cracks widened into full-blown rivalry. These next moments reveal how every phase of cooperation quietly planted the seeds of inevitable conflict. Number 1. We have the ping heard round the world. In an era defined by Cold War hostility and ideological walls, the world witnessed an unexpected crack in the ice between the United States and the People's Republic of China through an unlikely avenue: table tennis. In April 1971, during the 31st World Table Tennis Championship in Nagoya, Japan, a small act of sportsmanship became a monumental diplomatic breakthrough. When the Chinese team extended an invitation to the visiting American players to tour the Chinese mainland, the gesture stunned the global community. This unprecedented visit, later dubbed the Ping Heard Round the World, marked the first American delegation to set foot in Communist China since 1949. The event captured worldwide attention as journalists followed the American players exploring Beijing, walking the Great Wall, and engaging in friendly matches with their Chinese host. Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai masterfully used this sports exchange to launch a political signal, declaring, "You have opened a new chapter in the relations of the American and Chinese people." The symbolic outreach immediately translated into tangible progress. Washington lifted its 20-year trade embargo on China the same day. Beneath the charm of table tennis lay a carefully choreographed strategy. President Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger were already crafting a secret diplomatic plan, and this sporting spectacle served as the perfect soft power prelude. It allowed both sides to publicly express goodwill without confronting sensitive issues like Taiwan head-on. By using sport as a tool of diplomacy, both nations subtly prepared their citizens for a historic realignment, making this event one of the most creative and powerful uses of soft diplomacy in modern history. At number 2, we have the unthinkable handshake. Few diplomatic moments in history rival the shock and significance of President Richard Nixon's 1972 visit to Beijing, an event so improbable it was once considered unthinkable. On February 21, 1972, Nixon, a staunch anti-communist, became the first U.S. president to set foot in the People's Republic of China, signaling a dramatic realignment of global power. His meeting with Chairman Mao Zedong on that historic day represented far more than a symbolic handshake. It was a calculated geopolitical maneuver aimed at countering Soviet influence. The discussions between Nixon, Mao, and Premier Zhou Enlai were described as serious and frank, acknowledging a world undergoing great upheavals. This visit culminated in the signing of the Shanghai Communique, a landmark agreement that redefined diplomacy through constructive ambiguity. The communique allowed both sides to agree without fully resolving contentious issues, most notably the future of Taiwan. The U.S. acknowledged the One China principle but crafted language flexible enough to maintain informal ties and defense commitments with Taipei. This diplomatic balancing act enabled Washington to build relations with Beijing while retaining leverage in the Pacific. The move was strategic brilliance and diplomatic peril combined. It laid the foundation for modern U.S.-China engagement while embedding a permanent ambiguity that continues to define the Taiwan question. By strategically leveraging ideology, timing, and shared fear of Soviet power, Nixon's unthinkable handshake reshaped the global order and remains one of the most defining moments in the evolution of U.S.-China relations. At number 3, we have the Congressional Veto Normalization meets the Taiwan Relations Act, 1979. The final act in the long drama of U.S.-China normalization came under President Jimmy Carter, and it revealed the deep contradictions embedded within American diplomacy. On January 1, 1979, Washington officially recognized the People's Republic of China as the sole legal government of China, ending 3 decades of diplomatic isolation and opening the door to full trade, cultural, and technological exchange. Chinese Vice Premier Deng Xiaoping's subsequent visit to the U.S. later that month symbolized a new strategic partnership in the Cold War context, as both nations sought to counterbalance the Soviet Union. Yet this triumph of diplomacy triggered immediate political turbulence back home. Carter's unilateral decision to terminate the Mutual Defense Treaty with Taiwan sparked outrage in Congress, leading to the swift passage of the Taiwan Relations Act in April 1979. The TRA became a cornerstone of the complex duality that still defines U.S. policy today. It recognized Beijing diplomatically while legally committing Washington to Taiwan's self-defense. The act required that the U.S. provide defensive arms to Taiwan and maintain its capacity to resist coercion, ensuring that America's security ties to Taipei would persist indefinitely. This law effectively institutionalized managed friction between the U.S. and China, a balancing act between diplomatic recognition and military deterrence. While the Carter administration sought stability through engagement, Congress ensured that Taiwan's security remained a permanent factor in American foreign policy. This moment exposed the divided nature of U.S. governance and embedded the Taiwan issue at the heart of U.S.-China tensions, setting the stage for future confrontations, including those that resurfaced decades later during Trump's trade war. At number 4, we have the end of the honeymoon Tiananmen and the ideological schism. By the late 1980s, U.S.-China relations appeared to have entered a new era of mutual benefit. China was opening economically, and Washington viewed engagement as the path to modernization and moderation. But that illusion collapsed overnight in June 1989, when the world watched the Chinese government brutally suppress student-led pro-democracy demonstrations in Tiananmen Square. What had begun as a hopeful spring of reform ended in tanks and gunfire, forever redefining the moral and ideological boundaries of the relationship. President George H.W. Bush, who had once championed deeper engagement with Beijing, faced an immediate diplomatic crisis. His administration swiftly suspended military sales, halted high-level exchanges, and condemned the repression, even as U.S. allies joined in imposing sanctions. Yet Bush's response, while symbolically firm, was strategically cautious. He resisted calls from Congress for sweeping economic punishment, choosing instead a limited sanction strategy that punished human rights violations without dismantling the long-term diplomatic framework painstakingly built since Nixon's 1972 visit. Behind the scenes, Bush even sent secret envoys to maintain quiet channels with Beijing, believing that isolating China would drive it further toward extremism. This controversial balancing act, punishing oppression while preserving engagement, became a defining feature of U.S. policy toward China for decades. It exposed the core contradiction of America's China strategy, the tension between moral idealism and pragmatic geopolitics. The Tiananmen tragedy shattered the romantic notion of inevitable liberalization through trade and cemented the ideological divide that would continue to shadow bilateral relations, shaping U.S. foreign policy well into the 21st century. At number 5, we have weaponizing tariffs, the decade of MFN uncertainty. The 1990s transformed trade policy into a political battlefield where ideology, economics, and diplomacy collided head-on. After the shock of Tiananmen, the U.S. Congress seized upon a powerful tool to pressure Beijing China's most favored nation trade status. Once a routine trade designation, MFN suddenly became the yearly flashpoint for U.S.-China relations. Each renewal ignited fierce debates in Congress and across American media. Should the United States continue granting low tariffs and open markets to a regime accused of human rights violations, intellectual property theft, and nuclear proliferation? Lawmakers such as Senator Jesse Helms and Representative Nancy Pelosi led bipartisan efforts to condition renewal on verifiable progress in human rights and labor standards. The annual MFN review became a ritualized political drama, symbolizing America's moral ambivalence and China's rising influence. The uncertainty caused anxiety among global investors, forcing U.S. companies to lobby aggressively for stability. This decade-long tug-of-war taught Beijing a critical lesson. Washington's economic engagement was deeply vulnerable to domestic politics. The MFN controversy revealed the fragility of constructive engagement and set the stage for a historic shift. When Congress finally voted in 2000 to grant China permanent normal trade relations, it closed this turbulent chapter and paved the way for Beijing's entry into the World Trade Organization, a decision that would have seismic consequences for global manufacturing and U.S. economic policy. At number 6, we have brinkmanship in the Strait confronting China's coercion. By the mid-1990s, the fragile peace between Washington and Beijing faced its most dangerous test since normalization. The spark came in 1995 when Taiwan's President Lee Teng-hui, a symbol of the island's democratic evolution, visited the United States to speak at Cornell University, his alma mater. Beijing viewed the trip as a grave provocation. interpreting it as a step toward Taiwanese independence. In response, the People's Liberation Army launched an aggressive campaign of intimidation that would become known as the Third Taiwan Strait Crisis. Over the course of 8 months, China conducted live-fire military exercises and multiple ballistic missile launches near Taiwan's ports and shipping lanes, deliberately escalating tensions in the run-up to Taiwan's first direct presidential election. The goal was clear: to warn Taipei and Washington that any move toward independence would invite military retaliation. But Beijing's strategy backfired. President Bill Clinton, under pressure to assert American credibility, ordered the largest U.S. naval deployment in Asia since the Vietnam War. 2 carrier battle groups, including the USS Independence, sailed into the region, projecting unmistakable deterrence and signaling that the United States would not tolerate coercion against a democratic ally. The confrontation de-escalated without direct conflict, but it fundamentally altered the strategic calculus on both sides. For Washington, the crisis reaffirmed its commitment to maintaining peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. For Beijing, it underscored the urgent need to close the technological and naval gap that allowed U.S. dominance. The aftermath fueled China's decades-long military modernization drive, shaping the future of Indo-Pacific power dynamics and setting the stage for the strategic rivalries that would later define U.S.-China relations in the 21st century. Number 7. We have the golden age of globalization, PNTR and the WTO. As the 20th century drew to a close, U.S.-China relations reached their most ambitious and ultimately deceptive high point. The Clinton administration's pursuit of permanent normal trade relations for China marked the grand finale of the decades-long engagement policy that began with Nixon's handshake in 1972. By the year 2000, President Bill Clinton argued that bringing China fully into the global trading system was not just good economics, it was a moral and strategic imperative. He passionately told Congress that supporting PNTR would open China's markets, expand U.S. exports, and most importantly, lead to a future of greater openness and freedom for the people of China. Congress agreed, and by 2001, China's long-anticipated entry into the World Trade Organization officially linked the two economies more tightly than ever before. The results were seismic. China's exports exploded, transforming it into the factory of the world, while American corporations enjoyed record profits from cheap manufacturing and vast consumer markets. Yet, beneath this apparent success, structural fault lines deepened. Washington's hope that economic engagement would trigger political liberalization proved disastrously naive. Instead, Beijing leveraged WTO membership to supercharge its state-controlled industrial model, strengthen Communist Party dominance, and accumulate vast trade surpluses. The U.S. in turn became increasingly dependent on low-cost imports, hollowing out domestic industries and fueling resentment across its working class. What was celebrated as the dawn of global prosperity would later be remembered as the starting point of imbalance, the moment when Washington's optimism blinded it to Beijing's long game. This era of globalization laid the economic foundation for the tensions that would erupt in Donald Trump's 2018 trade war. At number 8, we have the spy plane standoff. Barely months after celebrating China's entry into the WTO, Washington and Beijing were thrust into one of the tensest military confrontations since the Cold War. On April 1, 2001, a U.S. Navy EP-3 reconnaissance aircraft collided mid-air with a Chinese J-8II fighter jet over the South China Sea, about 70 miles off Hainan Island. The Chinese jet disintegrated, killing its pilot, while the damaged American plane made an emergency landing at a Chinese military base. The 24 American crew members were detained for 11 nerve-wracking days as China demanded an apology. Inside the wrecked plane, Chinese authorities stripped out sensitive U.S. intelligence equipment despite the crew's desperate destruction efforts. The standoff known as the Hainan Incident brought the newly inaugurated George W. Bush administration face-to-face with the fragility of U.S.-China relations. Behind closed doors, furious negotiations took place, culminating in the release of the crew after Washington issued a carefully worded expression of regret. The aircraft, however, was only returned months later, dismantled, boxed, and shipped home piece by piece. The episode revealed a stark truth. Decades of economic integration had done little to bridge the military and ideological divide. China's aggressive response reflected its growing determination to assert sovereignty and challenge U.S. surveillance activities in its near seas. For Washington, it was a rude awakening, proof that prosperity did not equal partnership. The spy plane standoff underscored that beneath the polished rhetoric of cooperation, Both nations remained locked in deep strategic mistrust, setting the tone for a new era of militarized competition in the Pacific. At number 9, we have the crisis of confidence accelerating the power shift. The global financial crisis of 2008-2009 marked the moment when the delicate balance between the United States and China permanently shifted. For decades, America had been the architect of global finance. But when Wall Street collapsed, it was Beijing, not Washington, that emerged looking more resilient and capable. While millions of Americans lost jobs and homes, China responded with an enormous state-led stimulus plan that poured money into infrastructure, railways, and construction. The move not only stabilized China's economy, but reignited its growth at a speed the US could not match. In a matter of years, China's GDP surged while America's stagnated, shrinking the gap between the two economies faster than anyone had predicted. For Chinese leaders, this was ideological validation the West's financial collapse proved. In their eyes, the superiority of their state capitalist model. In the US, the crisis ignited a wave of anxiety and introspection. American policymakers began to question whether engagement had empowered an economic rival rather than a partner. Discussions of a new G2, a supposed global duopoly of US and Chinese leadership, briefly emerged, but beneath the rhetoric, mutual trust had evaporated. Beijing became more assertive in its industrial policies, doubling down on state control, while Washington's patience with unfair trade practices thinned. The 2008 crash, once seen as a temporary shock, ultimately redefined the US-China dynamic. It transformed a strategic partnership into an uneasy rivalry, one driven not only by economics, but by competing visions of global order. At number 10, we have the formalization of rivalry, the pivot to Asia. By 2011, the facade of partnership between the United States and China had officially crumbled. The Obama administration's pivot to Asia, later called the rebalance, marked a decisive strategic turn, one that recognized China's growing influence as the central challenge to US global leadership. Announced in late 2011, the policy sought to reorient American diplomacy, trade, and military assets toward the Indo-Pacific after a decade dominated by the Middle East. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton declared that the US was underweighted in Asia, signaling a new focus on alliances, regional diplomacy, and naval presence. The deployment of 2,500 Marines to Australia, expanded defense ties with Japan and the Philippines, and closer coordination with ASEAN all underscored Washington's intent to preserve freedom of navigation and regional balance. Officially, the White House denied that the pivot was meant to contain China, but Beijing saw it differently. To Chinese leaders, this was a thinly veiled attempt to encircle and constrain their rise, especially as the US deepened defense cooperation with India, Vietnam, and other Asian nations. The pivot to Asia thus became the geopolitical bookend to the engagement era that began in 1972. It was the moment Washington admitted that economic integration had failed to moderate China's ambitions, and that the future would be defined by strategic rivalry, not partnership. This rebalancing set the stage for every confrontation that followed trade, technology, and beyond, making it the true prelude to the Trump-era trade war. The US-China trade war of 2018 wasn't a sudden eruption. It was the final stage of a half-century built on contradictions. From Taiwan's unresolved status to the ideological divide after Tiananmen and the widening economic imbalance after WTO entry, every pillar of engagement carried within it the seeds of collapse. When the Cold War logic faded, only rivalry remained, and confrontation became inevitable. If you found this breakdown insightful, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more deep dives into global power shifts. Thanks for watching.